Okay. Hey, everybody. Let's finish up the semester. I prepared all of the slides, and again, the same plan. I'm hoping for, 15-minute, more or less, sections on each of these topics. We're going to start off with bioethics in this big section that I'm just going to title Public Health. And the syllabus, it was human enhancement, and I'll still talk about that, but I've rearranged some of the material. So hopefully that will, still be of interest to you. Okay. So we're going to start off with a discussion of some codes of ethics, some early codes of ethics, and lead forward from that. And then we're going to discuss a person named Henrietta Lacks and some medical breakthroughs that came about because of her, or at least because of some cells that she provided unknowingly. Then we're going to go on to discuss human experimentation. Some of this will be particularly troubling, but it's important in our final push towards discussing some of these concepts in bioethics that I think are going to be important to the rest of the discussion throughout the rest of this section. Okay, so let's get started. This is a kind of a bad timeline that I slapped together. The point to pay attention to here is that there was some, this is the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century so far. And we've had a number of different codes of ethics that have been formalized in this time period. Nuremberg Code, Declaration of Helsinki, the Belmont Report are just three of these that I'll spend a little bit of time talking about. And one thing that you'll notice that I'll come back to later on is how they came about before, during, and after lots of other events were happening. And when we get into the details of some of those events, we'll see that a lot of these codes of ethics were horribly violated. And in fact, we seem to be restating the same codes again and again, the same ideas again and again, and it doesn't seem to change our behavior or how we act about it. You may have heard of the Hippocratic Oath. I've witnessed Hippocratic Oaths before. I always thought they used to say things like, first I will do no harm. They never quite say that. They do say something of this sort, right? Aim to use their power to help the sick to the best of my ability and judgment. There's a lot of things that are missing from this oath. It's not the oath's fault. I think Hippocrates had the best intentions in mind, and humans would violate any sorts of words that people would say. Nevertheless, there's some things that we'll talk about in the later lectures that will show how there's some painful gaps in any number of oaths. So in the 1800s and 1900s, there were a number of explicit statements about how doctors viewed themselves. The idea from Claude Bernard was to conduct only experiments that are innocent or may do good. Try not to harm patients. William Osler and Johns Hopkins doctor said, we have no right to use patients entrusted to our care for the purpose of experimentation unless direct benefit to the individual, not society, that particular individual is likely to follow. Johns Hopkins becomes a player in our story in the next act of this lecture. So the fact that we were saying this as early as 1907, and some of the acts that we'll be talking about are in 1950s in the same institution, should give some pause, right? Peabody, in Harvard gives this idea of informed consent, which eventually gets formalized in several codes. So that's some early gesturing towards how it is ethical for medical professionals to behave. And I think leaving it implicit was thought to be all well and good until the Second World War. During the Second World War, some really horrific things occurred to prisoners of war. We talked about them, and we talked about the space race and how Werner von Braun was using slave labor in concentration camp prisoners to build his rockets. In fact, more people died building the rockets than died from being hit by them. After the war, nations of the world decided to try to take some of these soldiers and doctors and experimenters to trial. And if you read some of these transcripts, they're some of the most horrific things that you can read of humans doing things to other humans. You did not want to be a twin in Germany or in any area that Germany conquered during World War II. You didn't want to be Jewish, Roma, disabled, gay, a professor, a journalist, any number of other things. But if you were any of those, you certainly did not want to be a twin. They did horrific things to twins. They did horrific things to everybody. The problem is very few of these experiments actually returned any positive medical outcome. A lot of this was really shoddy science with really bad controls. And the end result were that a lot of people were found guilty and hanged or sentenced to life imprisonment or something of the sort. People, the scientific community took the lesson from Nuremberg quite seriously and decided to propose this Nuremberg Code in 1947. The idea for the Nuremberg Code was to emphasize the idea of experiments only with voluntary subjects that are informed, as the experiments being medically justified in some way and targeted in such a way as to minimize physical and mental suffering. It's basically the top 10 list of what we should do for any sort of experiments. We need to do medical experiments in order to test medicines, right? So you either do experiments in controlled settings with limited groups of people, or when you release the medicine, you're doing an uncontrolled natural experiment. And so after World War II, medical doctors and really anybody that worked with humans came together and agreed to this top 10 list of having qualified staff in good facilities with reasonable risks, where subjects were able to quit if they felt that there were problems. And the staff were supposed to stop experiments as well. If you've studied any psychology, the Milgram experiments or the Stanford prison experiments, you know that we almost instantly violated this. So perhaps it's not a surprise what ended up happening here. A lot of these were seen as applying to volunteers, not patients. That shouldn't be an 11 here, but this is how people interpreted the Nuremberg Code. So with that, we'll move on to discussing something that I'd gestured at in the previous slide. And so we'll get through this, and then we'll do the second half of this lecture in a different video. So next, we're going to discuss Gila. And to discuss Gila, we need to understand who Henrietta Lacks was. She was a mother of 5 children, one of 10 siblings who had been sent to live with her relatives during the Great Depression because her parents couldn't afford to raise them all. So she was raised by her grandfather um, with several other cousins and whatnot. She had 5 children over the next couple of years until she was diagnosed with cervical cancer in 1951. She went to Johns Hopkins to get medical treatment. At the time, that was where Black people could get treated, and they would get treated when there was time and energy and effort. And usually the doctors didn't bother asking for consent or even really talking to their patients. It was kind of a service that they thought that they did. And so she had some cells removed from her to study her tumor, the way everybody had cells removed. She was treated with radium sewn into her body and died later that year. So her cells were removed and eventually became important, and I'll talk about that shortly. So far, I want to say that all of this that happened is bad in the sense that it was bad from bad times, but I don't think that the doctors were doing anything particularly untoward by removing cells from her without her consent. Again, this is stuff that we wouldn't do now, but the real problem in this story comes with how her how her children are subsequently treated. So one thing to note before we move on is that at this point in human history, we had not been able to culture, that is, grow human cells outside of the human body for more than about 40 generations. It's something called the Hayflick limit. And we'd been trying for decades. Scientists thought that they had succeeded in doing this a couple of decades before, but it turned out that they were just reintroducing new cells. For whatever reason, the cells taken from Henrietta Lacks's cervical cancer were able to reproduce forever. In fact, these cells still exist. They've mutated enough that they bear very little resemblance to her own genetic code. But her cells created the first immortal cell line, cells that could grow on indefinitely beyond the 40 generation limit that had plagued science before. The term HeLa comes from the first 2 letters of her name. George Gay, the doctor treating her at the time, misstated her name when he talked to the press, and nobody ever told her family for the next couple of decades that her cells had been so important. But the medical community in Johns Hopkins thought that they were doing the right thing. They were sending these cells to scientists all around the world for free, basically. They ended up advancing medical science more than almost any other discovery for a long time. These particular cells were the cells that Jonas Salk used in order to cure polio. We used these to figure out how many chromosomes humans had, detect disease, discover in vitro fertilization, cloning, cure HPV, basically everything else. In the 1970s, her family had their blood drawn. They weren't told why. Her family became a subject of lots and lots of ignorant abuse, basically. And even though billions of dollars were made from this cell line, and all of the best innovations in the world came from these, her family, her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are still living in rural Virginia, and they're still extremely, extremely, extremely poor. So this was one of these discoveries that medical science at the time thought was, and still, I mean, it is one of the great medical discoveries of all time. They were used in all sorts of things. We sent them to the moon and back. We've grown them in labs all around the world, and there's been thousands and thousands of papers published from results from these cells. But as late as 2013, when the Gila genome was published publicly, nobody bothered to ask the family if it was okay to publish their medical information, right? Because the genome of their mother and grandmother could tell potential insurers and could tell anybody information about current people that are still alive. These were people that were essentially mistreated. In other semesters, I assigned the video The Immortal Life, or the movie The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks with Oprah Winfrey. If you have the time, I recommend reading the book that it was based on. This is one of those fascinating stories where it's hard to truly be angry at George Gay, who didn't make millions of dollars off of this. And what he did with her cells ended up leading to lots of good things in the world. The problem, of course, is that nobody cared about the people that were that helped make this possible. That'll be a theme in the next video, as we'll see.